Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to take our first deep dive look at Dark Strike Fighter format, also known as the summer of 2009. Dark Strike Fighter was such a powerful card during this format, it went from 3 copies all the way down to 0 after the format. For those of you who didn't play back then, and obviously that might be a large portion of the viewing audience, Dark Strike Fighter back in 2009 was more often than not thought of as the most powerful synchro monster in the entire game. So much so, as I alluded to, it was eventually banned at the end of the format, and so much so that Konami has actually had to completely rework and errata its effect in order for it to be removed from the modern day banned and restricted list. But back in 2009, what Dark Strike Fighter allowed you to do was in main phase 1 or 2, key part there, or 2, tribute monsters any quantity, and inflict damage to your opponent's life points equal to the number of levels that you've tributed times 200. And this was not a hard once per turn. This was not once per turn per copy either. It allowed you to essentially tribute all of the monsters that you had on the field during either main phase 1 or main phase 2 and inflict damage to your opponent's life points equal to the quantity of levels that you have tributed times 200. Essentially what that allowed you to do was use your battle phase to put a lot of big powerful monsters on the field, like Dark Strike Fighter himself with 2600, and then in main phase 2 tribute off your entire board and inflict any damage that you didn't otherwise inflict with battle to your opponent's life points directly, ultimately winning you the game. And during this format, there were several decks, specifically Synchro Cat, which revolved around putting 2 monsters on the field that are level 4 and 3 to very quickly go into Dark Strike Fighter and either take out tons of your opponent's life points in big swings, or even just generate card advantage with things like Arcanite Magician. So today we're going to take a deep dive look at just that, a Synchro Cat deck, a deck that revolves around the power of Summoner Monk and the ability to special summon from the deck a second copy of Summoner Monk, but then eventually end with the also powerful Rescue Cat. Both of these cards were semi-limited at the time, but the double Monk, double Rescue Cat package reliably allowed you to tutor out tuners and non-tuners to go into often Arcanite Magician, but usually if we're going for game Dark Strike Fighter, and then even things like Goyo Guardian if you simply don't have a level 4 handy, ultimately allowing you to generate card advantage, or honestly just OTK your opponent relatively quickly. For those of you who played back then, if you recall, the finals of the 2009 US Nationals pitted Chris Ferber, a close friend of mine actually, with his Synchro Cat deck against Michael Kohanam in his Gladiator Beast deck. If you go back and read the feature match of the finals, it was actually a pretty quick match. I remember watching it right there with my friend Devin and seeing Chris pretty handedly Monk double spell both games, ending the match relatively quickly. This deck simply had the power to do that. It was one of those decks that absolutely no doubt had that combo OTK center, but it also had the ability to grind you out pretty easily. With cards like Arcanite Magician and Pot of Avarice, Airbellum, you could be discarding cards and losing cards throughout the match and feel really frustrated because you're fighting against an OTK, but then also finding yourself losing card advantage at the same time. So Synchro Cat, really one of the most powerful decks of the time, and the very first deck that we're going to profile. Synchro Cat's going to be fighting oftentimes against Lightsworns at its full power. We'll talk about that when I get into the side deck today. But it's also going to be fighting against full power Blackwings, a pretty good Gladiator Beast deck, obviously mirror matches, and then even some what we used to call Salvo Dad. So relatively smallest of decks that were top tier at the time, but all of those decks were very powerful, and several of them were able to use Dark Strike Fighter, specifically Salvo Dad, Lightsworns, Blackwings, and Synchro Cat. But without further ado, let's take our first deep dive look at Synchro Cat. I will point out, this isn't one individual person Synchro Cat deck. Sometimes I actually profile virtually carbon copies of certain players' decks. I've actually kind of mashed together a little bit of the ideas of Jerry Wang and Billy Brake and Dale Bolito, some of the top players at the time, looking at their top decks from either one of their nationals or the SJC that occurred in Indianapolis right after the national season. So this isn't a single top player Synchro Cat deck. It's a little bit of a modern interpretation of what one may have looked like without going too overboard, and I think it is still authentic to the time period, but it's not just one single player's, but I think it's a pretty good version. Nevertheless, let's take a deep dive look for the very first time at Synchro Cat.
All right, we'll first start with the combo cards, which are 2 copies of Rescue Cat and 2 copies of Summoner Monk. Both of these were semi-limited, or else we would have honestly just run 3 copies of each. These really are your underlying win conditions. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Summoner Monk plus 2 spells in hand is actually 8,000 damage to an open board, which this deck was able to do quite frequently. Summoner Monk, with the ability to summon a second Summoner Monk and then a subsequent Rescue Cat, allowed you to populate 4 monsters onto the board, 2 of them being Airbellums and 2 of them being level 4 non-tuners, allowing you a lot of versatility from access to Arcanite Magician to the often double Strike Fighter OTK. I'll talk about a little bit more of that when we get through the deck, but both of these You really want to see them as much as possible. This deck runs Pot of Avarice, so oftentimes you can actually resolve more than 2 Rescue Cats. Sometimes you can even go to 3 if it's really necessary. But usually these are the ways that you're not only taking advantage of the game in terms of raw card advantage, but dealing a lot of damage quickly. Then, of course, to go with the 3 Rescue Cats, we have 3 copies of Airbellum. And since we're talking about the cat package, I will also comment on the fact that I've elected to put 1 copy of Raikou and 1 copy of Dark Spacian Neopanther. Or Neospatian Dark Panther, rather. This deck needed a few non-tuner beast monsters. That way Rescue Cat, if you didn't actually draw Summoner Monk, could still go into a Synchro monster. So Rescue Cat could theoretically go into Goyo Guardian with a level 3 non-tuner and tuner. You could then also go into a level 5, which at this point is only Magical Android. We don't have Catastor or some of the more powerful level 5s yet. But nevertheless, having that versatility is still useful. I also liked having a level 2 because sometimes the combination of levels would allow you, using some of the other monsters in your deck, like Sangan, for example, to go into level 8s, right? If you go 3 plus 2 plus 3, right, going Airbellum plus Raikou plus a Sangan on the field, it just gives you some more versatility in terms of the levels and the access that you have to the extra deck. Neospatian is an interesting one. So the Dark Panther is included for a couple different reasons. One, it's a crush card target. This is a point in Yu-Gi-Oh! History where a crush card is legal. I'll already tell you that this deck is going to run it. And this card actually had some interesting uses. For example, if your opponent summoned Judgment Dragon in the Lightsworn matchup and they were unable to kill you with it, they just used it to clear your field or generate a little bit of card advantage, you could actually summon Panther, copy Judgment Dragon's effect, and blow up the field. Same is true with other things like Dark Arm Dragon. There are a lot of sort of these niche, weird scenarios where you'd realize, like, oh wow, the fact that I have Panther allows me to copy one of your card's effects and actually take advantage of it in ways that you don't necessarily anticipate. It's also, of course, a Rescue Cat target. This is way before, way before, a decade plus before probably, the errata on Rescue Cat. So Airbellum is going to discard cards out of your opponent's hand. Neospatian Dark Panther is going to copy your opponent's card effects. It's not like the effects are going to be negated. So the ability to have these weird scenarios where you could go, summon Rescue Cat, pop it off, summon this, copy Dark Arm Dragon, start to clear your board, attack with Airbellum, main phase 2 go into Goyo or something like that. It's actually pretty powerful. It allowed you to do things that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate being able to do. So that one Panther is really cool. A lot of scenarios where the Panther sort of out of nowhere takes advantage of the game. This isn't necessarily the first time that this card saw playability. We used to see Cat go into Test Tiger plus Panther in the Gladiator Beast mirror match. That's obviously not the case here. We're not going to run any Gladiator Beasts, but we are going to run the Singleton copy. Besides this, other cards that saw some popularity, you saw some people run Death's Koala. I didn't really love Death's Koala because it's not a crush card target. It's a little bit too much attack points, and it just seemed redundant. The 1800 defense, this deck's already running a spy package, so it just felt like that's a lot of monsters to set when also you take into consideration Raikou. And I felt like, maybe the burn damage matters. There are going to be games where, you burn your opponent for 1,200 life points and it matters because this deck can burn you out of nowhere with Dark Strike Fighter. But I felt like this card was just a little bit better. And honestly, a lot of times when you draw this, you kind of just want to lure it away or get rid of it as fast as possible anyway. So actually having the Death's Koala as an effect that you rely on didn't seem like a really great idea. So I went with Neospatian Dark Panther. That would be the decision I would have made way back in the day also. Then we have the Gravekeeper package. So the logic behind the Gravekeeper package is the 2000 defense is obviously pretty good. In a format where your opponent could theoretically be running Blackwings, the 2000 defense is obviously really strong. Unless they have Kalut, it does brick all of the main deck monsters. Bora, Shura, Sirocco, all of them. I guess Sirocco has its own effect that could change things a little bit. But for the most part, unless your opponents already have it with Gale or they plan on using Kalut, until they get into their extra deck, that 2000 defense can wall. And usually those effects would be in main phase 2 anyway. And you'd have one of these on the board, if not both of them, right? Your opponent has main phase 2, it's no big deal. And the reason why that's useful is if you follow that up by a summon of an Airbellum, now you have access to Arcanite Magician, obviously Black Rose Dragon, really powerful level 7s. The level 7s are the most powerful ones that you have access to, even Dark Strike Fighter, if that could potentially win you the game. And if you never draw Summoner Monk, but you actually resolve a Gravekeeper Spy, it would then allow you, if you had Rescue Cat, to use Rescue Cat's effect and get into double Airbellum 2 level 4s on the field. As I'll talk about in a little bit, this on an open field is game. So if you run some way of clearing your opponent's monster and then end the board with this game state, or at least get into your turn with this, right? These survived, you followed up with Summon Rescue Cat and double Airbellum. This is 8,000 damage with double Strike Fighter. And I'll talk about exactly what that looks like in a little bit. So the Gravekeeper Spy package had that. It also technically, because we're running one copy of Gravekeeper's Guard, allowed you to search out a Crush Card target. Crush Card is such a powerful card, we're going to have incidental ways of getting access to it. Rescue Cat technically is a Crush Card target. this is technically a crush card target. I'll also point out that guard actually isn't that bad against Gladiator Beast. It will bounce the Gladiator Beast to your opponent's hand before they get to tag out during the end of the battle phase. So it can at least slow your opponent down. And if you get that effect off and then summon Air Bellum, threaten attack directly, main phase 2 Arcanite Magician, you could have taken a lot of card advantage there and make it so that your opponent needs a lot to get back into the game. And then we have some sort of one-ups. We have, this was pretty common, a Gale, a non-Air Bellum tuner monster. It's also a dark. Access to this also allowed you to run cards in the extra deck like Blackwing Armor Master, which at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history was considered pretty good. This deck also runs double Mind Control, Brain Control, and full power Blackwings was one of the most common decks. So you technically could Brain or Mind Control your opponent's Blackwing monster and then special summon this. So you could actually make a play, even Black Rose your opponent's field and save your normal summon, right? Imagine that scenario where you Mind Control a Blackwing, a level 4 specifically, Special Gale, Black Rose the field, and now you go Monk double spell into an open field, usually going to be game. Then we have a single copy of Sangan. Obviously, it's going to search out all our combo pieces, crush card target. We have a single copy of Mystic Tomato. This wasn't overwhelmingly popular, but I loved Mystic Tomato in this deck. Because what Tomato let you do is let you crash, and you could go into Sangan and then crash, go into Cat or Summoner Monk and threaten the second turn with some type of combo. But what it also allowed you to do is if you had one of the slower hands, you could play an advantage game instead of just a pure OTK game, where you cold wave your opponent, which I am going to include in the spell lineup, crash the Tomato, search Monk, and then in main phase 2, use Monk's effect to get Rescue Cat, and then from there, clear your opponent's field, or maybe go Monk into Rescue Cat, and then have double Air Bellum, and now you can go into Arcanite Magician, pop your opponent's board, and sit on a second Arcanite Magician, and threaten it again on the following turn. The reason why that's so good is Cold Wave is going to make it unable for your opponent to set any spell or trap cards for a turn, or activate any, obviously. So you could theoretically really slow down the game, all because a Mystic Tomato is able to crash and search out a Summoner Monk. So I really loved that play. It really caught a lot of people off guard, the ability to crash a Summoner Monk. And if your opponent attacks a Summoner Monk, or rather a Mystic Tomato, and you end their turn with Summoner Monk on the field, this isn't a format where people are going to have a lot of things like Smashing Ground. They could kill it. It's not inconceivable. But if they don't have a way of killing it, and they made the mistake of attacking your Mystic Tomato, you're threatening Summoner Monk on board and saving your normal summon for the following turn. It also can obviously search out crush card targets like Sangan. So I really liked having at least one copy of Mystic Tomato. I liked Cyber Valley. A lot of players elected to run more than one Cyber Valley. Jerry Wing specifically topped the US Nationals with a version that had 3, and I kind of like that version too. I decided only to put 1 in because I do like it combined with Mind Control and obviously Brain Control. This deck also, if it slows the game down with things like the Spies, can sometimes get a little bit of card advantage with it. So I like Cyber Valley. It's a cool card. It's always been one of my favorite cards. And this deck has plenty of dark monsters. Dark Arm Dragon is limited to 1 at this point, but it's still such a power card. You could always manipulate your graveyard with Pot of Avarice to get yourself back down to 3. You have plenty of darks, right? You have the Monks, you have the Panther, you have the Spy package, you have the Sangan, Mystic Tomato package, you have Gale. It does happen. Not all the time. Plus you have the extra deck where there's sometimes dark monsters, like Dark Strike Fighter, for example. So it really worked well in this particular deck. Then, one of the best friends of Rescue Cat has always been Pot of Avarice. One single Rescue Cat going into Air Bellum Mole, or Air Bellum Panther, or Air Bellum Raikou is already going to put 4 monsters into the graveyard. If you consider the Synchro monster on the field will eventually find its way to the graveyard. That's already 4 cards. If you really want to play a long game and resolve Rescue Cat multiple times, you can really rely exclusively on Pot of Avarice to do that. So double Pot of Avarice allows this deck to play its secondary game plan, which is the advantage grind you out game plan, because the deck has easy OTKs with Monk, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But if you're not doing that, what you're really doing is pushing through card advantage with cards like Arcanite Magician, and then reusing cards like Rescue Cat multiple times, and getting the +1 with Pot of Avarice. Not everybody elected to use this, but I felt like in order to really profile the quintessential Synchro Cat deck, I really needed to include Cold Wave. And I love Cold Wave as a card. I feel like it's just one of those unique card effects that's really hard to replicate, and when used properly can really win a game single-handedly. What Cold Wave does is you have to activate it at the beginning of main phase 1. Neither player can activate or set spell and trap cards for a full turn rotation. The reason why that's so good is with cards like Arcanite Magician combined with Cat plus Monk, you can clear your opponent's field and make it so that it passes back to them. They have no field in terms of spell and traps or maybe even monsters. Now they have to play with only monster effects, and this isn't modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Where that's really easy. A lot of the cards at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history rely on having spell or trap card activations, and a lot of people are running sort of your typical 7 to 8 trap cards, a lot of defensive trap cards, so if they draw Mirror Force or Torrential for the turn, they can't do anything with it. It's really one of those unique card effects that can shift the game into your favor. Obviously, there are some threats and some weaknesses, right? Your opponent could summon Judgment Dragon, and then you're kind of the one that feels silly. Your opponent could summon their Summoner Monk. It's not inconceivable that they beat you because you activate Cold Wave, but I feel like if you pinpoint a game state where Cold Wave can shift the game into your favor, it works really well. And worst case scenario, this isn't the best logic, because you could say this about a lot of cards. It's also just a spell to discard with Summoner Monk, which is not the best logic, because you could say that about every spell card, but this one does serve a function in this particular deck. To go along the sort of spell and trap card, either removal or stun effects, we have a Giant Trunade, Heavy Storm, and MST. I've elected to put Trunade in this deck, which not everybody does, because I am playing Royal Oppression in the main deck. Then we also have My Body's a Shield, which also sort of combines with this package. My Body's a Shield was good. One, it's a spell, which I know seems like flawed logic, but you do want to have a lot of spells in a monk deck. That's part of it. But it also serves the function of offense and defense, depending on the matchup. So it allows you to push through your Summoner Monk plays, right? Your opponent plays Torrential or Bottomless on your Air Bellums. You chain this. If your opponent has no other back rows, that could be what pushes through the Dark Strike OTK, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Besides that, this is a format where Geyseris is really popular out of GBs. Judgment Dragon's really popular, obviously, out of Lightsworn. Same thing with things like Celestia. Icarus Attack could target monsters. A lot of times you could set this against an opponent that's playing these cards, and your opponent, summons Judgment Dragon and tries to pop the whole field. Well, you chain My Body's a Shield, pay the 1,500, and totally negate and destroy, making it act almost as a pseudo Solemn Judgment in that. So what's really cool here is it has that protection effect when you're making an aggro push or making a combo push with some of your plays, but it can also act defensively depending on the matchup. So I really like My Body's a Shield. It's not really a card you want to draw a ton of, but it had a lot of flexibility, acting as a spell that can both be offensive and defensive, especially at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, where there were a lot of really powerful cards like Geyseris, even Dark Arm Dragon, though they'd probably target the back rows, but especially something like Judgment Dragon, which would fall victim to it. Then we have the sort of Mind Control, Brain Control package. This deck with 4 of your sort of typical powerful tuner monsters with the triple Air Bellum and the single Gale. Had a lot of flexibility there in terms of taking your opponent's monsters and synchroing, and it also is partially one of the reasons why I included a Cyber Valley. Having all 5 of these allowed you to take advantage of taking your opponent's monsters. You also theoretically could just take an opponent's monster, clear the board, and then monk double spell your opponent. That theoretically happened all the time. Mind Control is obviously unbelievable in a mirror match when people are studying things like Gravekeeper Spy. Take their spy, flip it, you get the effect. You can take your opponent's Raikou in the mirror match. Raikou wasn't the most overwhelmingly common card. If anything, people only played 1, but it's not impossible that it would happen. And then if your opponent ever set this in something like Lightsworns, obviously it's going to be this or something bad like Necrogardener. Just all in all, Mind Control, really awesome card. Brain Control has always been really good, especially in a deck like this. So those are our Mind/Brain Controls. And then a couple copies of Book of Moon. Book of Moon's just a powerful spell that's offensive, defensive. You can do a bunch of different things with Book of Moon. Obviously, you can set it. Your opponent plays Rescue Cat. You can chain it on a tuner or the non-tuner. You can protect one of your monsters. You can reuse flip effects. It really does just about everything you want. And it's also a spell which this deck should include quite a few of in order to make it so that Monk is always live. Trap lineup, I've elected to use a Solemn Judgment trap lineup. This wasn't necessarily staple, but I've always loved Solemn Judgment, and I felt like with this deck, if you're going to be relying on Monk pushing through OTKs, it's useful to have My Body's a Shield, Solemn Judgment, obviously the Cold Wave package, Heavy Storm, things like that. Make it so that you can reliably go through and actually OTK with Monk double spell. So I have 3 Solemn Judgments. I have 2 copies of Bottomless. Bottomless was pretty common. It was really good against basically every deck in some capacity. So it's always been pretty good against GBs. Most of the GBs you care about are targetable by Bottomless, right? I'm talking about Bestiari, which was limited to 1, right? You Bottomless the Bestiari, that's a big deal. You could theoretically chain it to Geyseris, so that doesn't feel as good. But even a normal summon of a Darius, Laquari, etc., you want to hit them with this. We're at a point where Quest is technically out, so that also with 1600 attack. It's not the original GB deck back from its first printing, so double Bottomless is good there. It cuts off Black Whirlwind. Your opponent summons Bora, Shura, or Sirocco. There's no attack points to register for the Black Whirlwind, so your opponent could go Whirlwind, Shura on turn 1. You flip Bottomless. Now they have this Black Whirlwind that, at least at this point, hasn't gained them any card advantage. Obviously, that's really good. You can use this on Air Bellum. If your opponent's willing to make a push because they kind of need to and they're desperate, you can hit all the Air Bellums they get off Rescue Cat. So obviously, across the board, it has good application. I have a couple one-ups here. I have Dust Shoot and Crush Card, which I think you should have run. Dust Shoot, for whatever reason, wasn't across the board a staple. I think that's silly. Dust Shoot's one of the best cards, especially in a format where people are trying to OTK as much as they are. Crush Card, one of the best cards of all time, especially at this point before the errata. This deck has plenty of targets, and they're targets that you can kind of tutor out when you need them through Mystic Tomato, through Spy, through Cat, etc. Even technically Monk is one. You can't tribute a face-up Monk, because that's just what the card says, but if you had just Crush Card, maybe you had no spells and you were Despot, you can technically set Monk and Crush Card it like that. So that's something to take into consideration if you play this deck. Mirror Force and Tarantula, because they were basically pseudo staples. And then I have one copy of Royal Oppression. I could see you use multiple copies of Oppression. This was, after Oppression Dad, Teledad format, where people did start to main deck Oppression, but a little bit before people's real appreciation for Vanity's Emptiness and Royal Oppression to the level that you might see a little bit later on. It's kind of that middle point where people started to realize it in Teledad format, then went away with it for a little bit, but I think it actually had a warranted spot in this deck, especially when you have cards like Giant Trunade, where you can use this aggressively, knowing that you can reset it yourself. So I really like having at least one copy of Oppression. And it basically stops every deck a little bit. Black Wings are going to special summon, Lightsworn special summon, Glad special summon, the Mirror Match, everything special summon. So having it, I think, is really good. Next, we'll go to the extra deck. So we have 2 copies of the format's namesake, which is Dark Strike Fighter. You needed at least 2 copies because the Dark Strike Fighter OTK required 2 copies. After I'm done talking about the extra deck, I will show you the OTK that I've been alluding to. But pre-errata, this card was absolutely crazy. We need at least 2 copies of Arcanite, maybe even 3. The most common way of making Arcanite, really the only way, is either Spy, Guard, Monk, plus a level 3, which in this case is Airbellum or Gale. Very reliable. If you're not going for the OTK with Dark Strike Fighter, you're going to grind your opponent out, killing 2 of their cards with Arcanite Magician, so really useful there. You need at least 1 Black Rose Dragon. It was unlimited, so you could play more than 1. I have found that this deck having Arcanite Magician usually can clear the field without needing to use Black Rose, and therefore having 2 Black Rose might be a little bit overkill. If you wanted to put Herbellum in instead because it's just a little bit more flexibility, I totally understand that. If you just wanted to play double Black Rose, you honestly could do that too. Don't forget about Black Rose's second effect. You do play Mystic Tomato. You do have a plant in your deck. You can change an opponent's defense position monsters. For some level 8s, we have double Stardust Dragon and Colossal. Colossal was especially good at this point because we're looking at a format where, against Lightsworns, the threat of summoning other Synchro monsters, or the risk is your opponent having Honest. Colossal Fighter was a reasonable way of playing around Honest. Yes, it was vulnerable to Raikou, Celestia, and Judgment Dragon, but if you got into those grindy game states where your opponent clearly doesn't have any of those cards, maybe they're relying on these weird hands with double Honest, you just throw this in defense or even be willing to attack things, and you can reliably assume that Colossal Fighter is going to survive, right? The safest way to attack an opponent's attack position Lightsworn monster is to attack it with Colossal, because then you just recur Colossal, and yes, they Honest you, but they basically just Honested you for damage, as opposed to actually killing something. You don't want to run a Stardust into an attack position Lightsworn, lose the damage and the Stardust. That's obviously a nightmare scenario. So Colossal Fighter had a role. That statement is also true about attacking into Blackwing monsters with Kalut. So the fact that Honest and Kalut were both really good made it such that Colossal Fighter had a spot in this deck. Then we have level 6s. This deck, of course, can go into level 6s because of Rescue Cat plus Airbellum and Panther. So Goyo's limited to 1, so we're going to obviously have it staple. Gaia is obviously the second strongest level 6, so you theoretically would want that because you could put Avarice back the cat. Maybe you already used Goyo. Honestly, you're probably going to pot back the Goyo anyway, so I could see you cut this based on that logic. This deck's not going to double level 6 you all that often unless it's using Panther, and there's only 1 Panther in the deck. You could, have Panther plus Saying, so it's not impossible, but I could see you cut one of these. Then Iron Chain just gives you another access to a level 6. Technically, we have Armor Master and Blade Armor because we have access to Gale, so it gives us a couple of the Blackwing cards. And then this format doesn't have Catastor. This is the best level 5. It's an android. You could need to make a level 5 because you have Raikou as your only non-tuner in the deck, or maybe it's just better to go into Raikou plus Airbellum. You don't need a level 6. Maybe Panther's gone, as I just said. Requires us to have access to something. In case you didn't play this format and you've been hearing me talk about Monk OTK, what in the world am I talking about? So just briefly before we talk about the side deck. All this deck really needed to do to win was have Monk and 2 spells. This combination of cards, which isn't as hard as you might think to accomplish, was enough to win the game. And what you would do is you would summon the Monk, you would discard a spell, and you would search your deck for a second Monk. This Monk would go off, and that would bring out Rescue Cat. And then Rescue Cat's effect would go off, and you would search your deck for 2 copies of Airbellum. The Airbellum and the first Monk would go into your first copy of Dark Strike Fighter. The second Monk and the second Airbellum would go into another copy of Dark Strike. It's Dark Strike because this is the highest attack points for a level 7 monster out of the extra deck, out of the Synchro deck or the Synchro monsters in your extra deck. Directly, each of these are going to deal 26. The effect of Dark Strike Fighter at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history is main phase 1 or main phase 2. You can tribute off any monster that you want as many times as you want per turn and inflict damage to your opponent's life points 200 times the monster's level. Well, 26 direct plus tributing itself is 7 times 2 or 14, meaning a direct attack with Dark Strike plus sacrificing it in main phase 2, which you're allowed to do, is 4,000, which means a second Dark Strike attack and shoot off main phase 2 are 2 4,000 increments, which is obviously 8,000 damage. It was way more potent of a combo than you might anticipate, because just Monk plus any 2 spells. It doesn't matter what the 2 spells are, which is why throughout the deck profile I kept commenting on, at the end of the day, Book of Moon is still a spell, right? You might prefer having it be a spell than play some type of defensive trap like, a third Bottomless, for example, and all of a sudden you're stuck with Monk plus Bottomless in Book instead of Monk plus 2 books, and now you can't OTK. So having spells really did matter. In terms of the matchups, this was not as diverse of a format as you might think. I really think these were the top decks, and it would be hard to convince me of the need to include anything else. We have GBs. So we're talking about a GB deck with 1 Bestiary that relies a little bit on War Chariot, a quest. It has the Cold Wave package 2. The old Cold Wave idea of Prisma plus Test Tiger was there. So cool deck. Got second at the US Nationals. We had full power Lightsworn, or at least relatively full power. It had 2 Judgment Dragons, so there were limitations on the deck, but it had Charge of the Light Brigade, which is incredibly powerful. There was a time period where it had no charge and 3 Judgment Dragons. I think the deck is better with 3 charges and 2 Judgment Dragons. So I'm going to call this full power, because going forward, not immediately the next format, but the format after, we had limitations to Necro, Lumina, Charge, and it really did start to water the deck down. So to me, this was full power Lightsworn format. We have, of course, the Mirror Match, and then we have basically full power Blackwings, triple Black Whirlwind, which has seen limitations over the years, triple Gale, which is a card that was limited at the end of this format. It didn't have triple Allure or anything like that. It only had 1, but nevertheless, it still had a really robust Blackwing package. It did not have Vayu. So for those of you who play Edison format, you're familiar with the Vayu Turbo package. It did not have Vayu, but I think otherwise you could consider it full power. It also had Dark Strike out of the extra deck, and Blackwing was a deck that had a lot of access to level 7 synchros because of Gale, right? You can go special Boris, special Gale, and now you have a bunch of damage on the field and the ability to make Dark Strike. So not only do I consider it full power because it had triple Gale and triple Whirlwind, I consider it full power because it had triple Dark Strike Fighter. The last deck wasn't popular until the end of the format, but it was a Black Salvo Dekoichi D-Hero deck popularized by Adam Korn. And then a lot of other good players like Jerry Wang ran it towards the end of the format. I honestly don't think it was as good as these decks. It was more a nostalgic deck for those people who really loved D-Heroes, but it was a fun deck. I played that deck at the end of that format because it was really fun. So these are the top decks. How are we going to counter it? Well, I have a couple of Legendary Jujutsu Masters, which are good against Gladiator Beasts, right? Your opponent attacks thinking it's a spy, which is going to be their assumption, and now they run into this. The monster goes to the top of the deck, so it sets back their draw phase, and they don't get to tag out. So Jujutsu Masters are really good. DD Crows are pretty good against Lightsworns, so that's there. We have Gores, which I didn't put in the main deck, which was really common in the main deck. But I have found playing older formats that people play around Gores a lot more than they probably did back in the day. If you're playing against an opponent who you don't think is going to play around Gores, for whatever reason that they feel that way, obviously having it inside deck's not a bad idea. It is one of the only ways of stopping Monk double spell. You're probably going to lose a lot of card advantage, and you're probably going to take a lot of damage. But if your opponent attacks directly with Dark Strike Fighter, thinking they can OTK you, and you drop Gores, they can attack over, if you put it in defense, you want to put it in attack mode, right? The 25 defense versus 27 attack. And then you have that 26 token. You do wall them right there. You are in a good position. So having this against the Mirror Match is especially good. You could, though, play the opponent who realizes that and cold waves you and leaves your back rows, and now all of a sudden you can't Gores. So you have to be very careful playing Gores, but it does have a role. We have double no mana crossout because it is good in the Mirror Match when you're setting cards like Spy and other things. I'm not sure to the extent that it's worth it per se, but it was a pretty common thing. And sometimes when I make these profiles, I'm trying to combine both a modern perspective with some of the older decisions that were made. Nobleman did see some popularity. This one, either way I would use, which is Light Imprisoning Mirror. Lightsworn is such a tough matchup. This card is phenomenal, obviously, against Lightsworn. Stops all their monster effects. Very, very few of yours. Cards like Raikou, but you could even side those out if you really wanted to. Having that card in your deck is really fantastic. A couple cards to stop your opponent when they heavy, Cold Wave, or True Nade you with the anticipation of trying to OTK you, which is usually what you would anticipate out of the mirror match, right? Your opponent plays Cold Wave, you Chain Roar. And now your opponent's in this weird position where they think to themselves, well, do I use my Monkin spell to just generate card advantage? Do I go into Arcanite Magicians? That is a game plan that the deck needs to be comfortable doing. But if you do that and you just end with Arcanite, pop some things, if now you go Monk double spell back, or you have the ability to do even more than that, maybe Dark Arm plus Monk spell or something like along those lines, the Threatening Roar is going to buy you the turn where now you OTK them back. So having cards like Roar in your deck are pretty good. We have a couple Mirror of Oaths in order to counteract specifically Gladiator Beasts. I thought Gladiator Beasts was a tough matchup, right? If the game doesn't go in your favor early on, it does snowball pretty quickly. So having some of these blowout cards is pretty good. And then for a 15 card, I like to go with Dust Tornado. A lot of players had Dust Tornado in their deck. Dust Tornado is especially good against Black Whirlwind, which is at 3. It's also good just as a chainable, right? Your opponent plays Icarus attack. They target your set monster in back row. Depending on how they use that Icarus attack, that could be a card advantage creating Icarus attack. And maybe they went Blizzard, summon something, Icarus, whether it's the Blizzard or the monster they summoned, and now it seems like a free monster that they're using Icarus and getting a +1. Well, if they're killing a face down, but you're Dust Tornadoing one of their other back rows, it doesn't feel as bad. And obviously you want to shut off the Black Whirlwinds as much as possible. So this might seem odd in a deck that has double Cold Wave, True Nade Heavy, and MST, but this is a little bit more targeted than you think, because I am really much thinking about Black Whirlwind or even Oppression out of the Blackwing decks. Anyway, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History, taking our very first look at Dark Strike Fighter format. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.